Like I said in my first rebuttal, you don't know how to interpret statistics, and you're proving my point. Even if we went with your analogy, every 11 minutes a woman is raped or assaulted. What you're refusing to acknowledge is just how many people live in the United States. There are 333 million people in the US. That leaves about 150 million men. So yeah, it is possible that a woman in the US can be assaulted once every 11 minutes with it still being less than 1% of the male population overall. And for one, you're just saying this on the internet. How do I know you're not exaggerating anything? And how do I know where your sources are come from and what kind of surveys they did? And here's another bombshell for you. According to the CDC and the Domestic Violence Hotline, hetero men are only slightly behind hetero women when it comes to reporting being the victim of domestic violence in a relationship. Now, if we factor homosexuality into the equation, gay men have the lowest rate of domestic violence overall, whereas lesbians by far have the highest rate. Lesbians on average only account for 1 out of 10 women, yet make up 1 out of 8 cases of domestic violence against women. But again, these are domestic violence stats. They don't tell us anything about rape or SA. But let's look at some other stats that women like you like to bring up as a justification for your prejudice against men. 1 out of 6 women report having been the victim of assault. Yeah, that doesn't mean that 1 out of 6 men are assaulting women. Now, when we factor in college campuses, this rate goes up to 1 out of 4 women. But here's the thing. There's over 100 male students on any given college campus. LSU, right up the road from me, has well over 1,000 male students at a time. Say LSU has about 5,000 male students and about 50 of them end up being sexual predators. That is still less than 1% of the entire male student body at LSU. Now, it stands to reason that some of those men might have multiple victims, which would account for the 1 out of 4 statistic in universities. But that still proves that less than 1% of men are guilty of this type of behavior. Another stat that women like this like to use is the prison population being about 90% male. But the ratio of men to women in prison tells us absolutely nothing about the male population overall compared to the number of men in prison. And here's where left-wing women lose their shit. Because 60% of the men in prison are black men who are in there for black-on-black crimes. Go ahead, bring up systemic bias, because I totally agree with you. I think that is definitely a thing and a problem that needs to be addressed. But I'm also going to argue that it's not just a racial problem, but a sex-based problem. You explain to me why so many female teachers get caught grooming their male students only to get off with a slap on the wrist. Better yet, go look up Hermisman vs. Sayer and get back with me. You explain to me why there are multiple cases of women molesting little boys and then suing them for child support once they become of age. Then there are multiple cases of hetero couples committing crimes together only for the woman to get a more lenient sentence than her male counterpart despite committing the exact same crime. Casey Anthony killed her baby. Anybody who's dug into the details of the case and that's the kind of person she was knows this. And yet, she was able to get away with it because she threw her own father under the bus by falsely accusing him of being a pedophile, which is actually very commonplace. And even Peacock went ahead and made a documentary trying to paint her as this misunderstood tragic figure when she's not. She's lying. In fact, one of the primary reasons women make false accusations is to cover up their own abuse or predatory behavior. Which is why only 1 out of 10 male victims who have been abused by a woman or raped by a woman come forward. And of that 10%, 2 out of 3 of them end up getting falsely accused by their abuser. And who do you think the general public and the courts believe without evidence? Not too long ago, there was a viral case of a woman out of California who stabbed her boyfriend over 100 times, and the judge just paroled her. Why? Because she was smoking weed and had a high. You explain to me how that makes any sense whatsoever. And the reality is, this systemic bias that women benefit from is nothing new. This goes back to before women even had equal rights. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker of Bonnie and Clyde was previously arrested for armed robbery early on in the bank robbery career. The jury let her get away with it and found her not guilty because she turned on the waterworks on the stand and cried a little pity party. Do you think a man would have been given the same privilege even in today's society? Prior to the trial of Lizzie Borden, the famed axe murderer, she was allowed to tamper with evidence that was going to be used against her. During the early days of the suffrage movement and the prohibition movement, you had an old granny by the name of Carrie Nations who traveled around the state of Kansas hacking up saloons with a tomahawk and what she called smashers. And even though she got arrested multiple times, she basically just spent the night in jail and no charges were ever pursued and she was allowed to go on her merry way, causing private property damage. So not only does the male prison population tell us absolutely nothing about exactly how many men are committing these types of crimes overall, women are getting away with the exact same type of behavior all the time because the courts do not hold them accountable. Y'all like to talk about white male privilege, but from where I'm sitting, white male privilege only exists if you come from money. Y'all ought to be calling it white female privilege, because we all know what happens when a little white girl screams, "Ask Emmett Till." And even if we look at women who are convicted, rightfully so, they're often treated as martyrs. This is the movie Monster, about the female serial killer Aileen Wuornos. Now, this woman did indeed have a tragic upbringing. She was molested, she was abused. But then she weaponized her trauma and used it as a justification to become one of the worst female serial killers in American history. And women are deifying this woman and treating her like she's some kind of martyr. Which, if anything, should tell every man that if your girlfriend is choosing bear over man, dump her and run. Nothing good ever comes from a woman who likes to weaponize her trauma to use it as a justification for prejudice. Okay, in all seriousness, I know that not every woman who complains about rape or SA or domestic violence is a serial killer. I'm just using your logic against you. You see, y'all are only taking the bear because of a cultural prejudice against men that has been normalized for far too long. And this cultural prejudice is based on an inability to interpret statistics accurately. Look, we get it. Rape happens, assault happens. There are terrible men out there, but there are terrible women out there and they get away with their behavior. Women will abuse men, probably at the exact same rates as men abuse women, and women are more likely to use knives, rolling pins, pots, pans, bottles, so on and so forth. But if a man comes forward about these abuse allegations, he's probably going to end up getting falsely accused over it. And if it's his word versus her word, the police are going to take her word any day of the week. Y'all go on and on and on about abuse and assault, but you never want to talk about just how much women do the exact same stuff, knowing they can get away with it with one accusation. And even if you are not guilty of this type of behavior, you probably have a really close friend who is, and you do not want to see them go to jail for the rest of their life, which is probably where they belong. But the reality is, times are changing and men have finally had enough and they're speaking out. They're calling their senators, they're calling their congressmen, they're campaigning for change. So yeah, by 2050, the female prison population is going to start rising sharply because women are finally going to start facing consequences for their actions. And if you're a good woman, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. But the fact of the matter is, enough's enough. The majority of men are not violent criminals, so stop treating us all like we are.